Let's talk about thesis statements for literary analysis essays. So you probably know what a basic thesis statement includes already. It includes a specific or narrow topic and an assertion or an argument about that topic. A thesis statement for a literary analysis essay has to accomplish a little bit more. It's going to answer how and why and so what questions. So we'll start off by talking about some tips for literary analysis thesis statements, and then we'll take a look at some thesis statements that are passing and then some that are not quite passing. So when you're crafting your thesis, after you've looked through the text that you're writing about, whether it's a short story or a poem or a play, and you've taken lots of notes and you have maybe a really rough scratch outline or you've done some pre-writing, you're going to start to form a tentative thesis, which should, of course, evolve as you work. You might start by addressing some sort of problem or tension or complexity or some aspect of the story or the text that other people have overlooked or other people have not focused on. You might go back to class discussions and look for areas where you felt like there was more to say or that the issue or the character was more complicated than other students were suggesting. Or you might read what scholars and critics have to say about the text and use their piece as a point of departure. You might agree with part of it and disagree with another part of it. There's no point in arguing something that everybody already agrees with, especially if you're writing about a text or if you're writing about an author that people have written about time and time again. So try to carve out your own niche. Try to focus on something that other people haven't focused on when possible. Your thesis should address meaningful questions. So we are not interested in plot summary for literary analysis essays. We are interested in more interpretive, analytical questions. So not what does a character do, but why does a character do something and how does the author convey the character's motivation? And also, so what questions? What's the significance of your argument? How does it help us to understand the text in a different way? Always narrow down your topic. I find myself giving the same advice to students over and over again. Sometimes students try to cover something too sweeping for an essay. Even for a research paper, your topic should be relatively narrow. Even for a dissertation or a 50-page essay, your topic is still going to be relatively narrow. So when in doubt, focus on a smaller part of the question. You can always broaden it later, but I recommend focusing on something so you can be really specific and be really nuanced with your analysis. Focus on analyzing one aspect rather than several components superficially. So it's much better to focus on one scene or one character or one setting than focus on several characters and try to cover too much. Don't just regurgitate or rephrase the prompt. A lot of times students will write a thesis that'll say something like, there are many differences and similarities between the characters, or the theme is important because, and you can see that they're trying to answer the prompt question, which I appreciate. I do want to see that you're answering the question, but generally the questions that I give you are pretty open-ended and they're pretty vague on their own. You have to do the hard work of forming your own specific question and then forming your own complex, sophisticated answer. Avoid making value statements about a text or an author. So generally, we don't want to make statements about how much we enjoyed reading the text or how talented the writer is. It's sort of a given that the writer is talented. Also, it doesn't really sound as if it's a literary analysis essay. It sounds more like it's a book club discussion, which is totally fine for in-class discussions. But for literary analysis essays, avoid complimenting the author. And also, we want to avoid making preachy statements. After all, most of the time we're writing about fiction, right? So if the character does something that you think is reprehensible, the author is not necessarily condoning that or endorsing that, right? So avoid value statements about the text or the characters. Focus on the how and why and so what questions. Make sure that your thesis requires proving. If somebody were to read your thesis, somebody who's read the text that you're writing about, and they were to say, yeah, that's kind of a given, then that's actually not a good sign. That means that your thesis does not require proving. Ideally, somebody who's read the text and spent some time with the text would read your thesis and say, okay, I wonder how they're going to prove that. What evidence will they use to support it? And then they'll be impressed when you support your complex argument throughout the essay. So it should require proving with examples from the text, with specific quotations. If it's a thesis that's obvious, there's no point in writing it. And generally, your thesis should be 1 sentence. 2 sentences is okay. Even a 3-sentence thesis would be fine. But if your thesis goes beyond that, you probably need to nail down your thesis a little bit more. You should be able to articulate to me, just in a conversation, very informally, what your argument is. If you find that you can't just explain to me in about a sentence what your argument is, that might mean that your thesis isn't quite precise enough, or you only have a vague understanding of your thesis. For a rough draft, that's okay, right? For the outlining phase, that's okay, but ultimately you should know what you are arguing. And if you can't form a plausible counter thesis, your argument's probably not debatable. So that's probably not a good thing. I think this is my best tip. So if a reasonable person who's read the text cannot form a plausible counter-argument or a thesis that departs from yours or disagrees with yours, doesn't mean it has to be the exact opposite, but if they can't form a counter-argument that's reasonable, if they could not support that with any examples from the text, that probably means that you're arguing something that's just not debatable. Like I've said a few times already, if your thesis is something that every reasonable reader agrees with, that means there's no point in writing it. Now, that does not mean that I want you to make some completely far-fetched, bizarre argument that is just not supported by the text. It's not true that in English classes, any answer is correct, but it is true that some answers are better than others, and it's all about how you support your argument, how you support your thesis with evidence from the text. So of course, you don't just want to come up with a controversial or crazy argument just for the sake of it. You have to support it. But on the other hand, there's no point in arguing something that we all take for granted, that we all agree with. Let's take a look at the passing and non-passing thesis statements. Just because some of these are passing thesis statements doesn't mean that they're perfect thesis statements yet. In fact, some of them are not quite A-level yet, but they're passing. They're getting the job done. And the non-passing thesis statements, well, I think those speak for themselves. So let's look at the first one. The experience of the speaker and how I discovered poetry is very ambiguous. This is quite generic. In fact, I could take out the title of this poem and sub in any poem or really any literary text, and it would still work. It's generic, right? By definition, almost, literature is ambiguous, right? Ambiguity is a good thing when it comes to poetry or novels. So this thesis statement is generic. A reasonable person could not write a counter argument and say there's no ambiguity in the poem, right? Because it's very rare that poems have zero ambiguity. Here's a better one. In How I Discovered Poetry, what the speaker discovers is the ambiguous power of words, their capacity both to inspire and unite and to denigrate and divide. So here it's not just saying that the experience is ambiguous. Here it's saying what's ambiguous, the ambiguous power of words. And it's much more specific. It gives a little bit of the so what, their capacity to inspire and unite and denigrate and divide. So this one is better. It could still be made more specific and more precise. It could also include a counter argument to make it even more debatable, but the second one is passing. London consists of 3 discrete stanzas that each end with a period. 2/3 of the lines are end stopped. So this is actually an impressive thesis, but it's not passing. Here's why. The person has made a really insightful or 2 really insightful observations about the poem. These are sophisticated observations, right, about the formal techniques in the poem. The problem is there's no so what, and it's not really debatable. You need to tell me, or the writer needs to tell me what I am to make of these formal techniques. Right now, it's just a high-level, insightful observation, but it's not making a debatable argument about the significance. Here's a better one. In London, William Blake uses a variety of formal techniques to suggest the unnatural rigidity and constraints of urban life. So here, this one doesn't even list the specific techniques like stanzas ending with periods or end-stopped lines. The person could have listed them, doesn't really matter. But they include why we should care and the so what. Why is Blake using these techniques? To suggest the unnatural rigidity and constraints of urban life. So here there is a debatable argument. Someone else could say, yeah, I see Blake using these formal techniques, but for a different purpose, right? For a different reason. So someone else could agree with part of that thesis, but not all of it, right? A reasonable person could do that. A reasonable person could disagree. That's a good thing. A Streetcar Named Desire uses a lot of Darwinian language. That's also an insightful observation, right? Not everyone would notice that about the play. But the problem is it's not that debatable, and it doesn't include the how or the why or the so what. It's just kind of a what answer to a what question. Here's a better one. A Streetcar Named Desire asks whether or not it is truly the fittest who survive in contemporary America. So it's still a little bit vague and a little bit broad, but here there's some significance or some how and why and so what to the use of Darwinian language. Why do we have Darwinian language? Well, because the playwright is asking this specific question or getting us to think about this specific question. Still could be improved, but much better. Here's another one. There are many differences and even a few similarities between Offred's mother and Aunt Lydia, and these similarities help us understand an important theme. So at first glance, this might seem like an effective thesis statement, but if you look at it, what the thesis is really saying is there are differences and similarities between these two characters, and these similarities help us understand an important theme. I could take that thesis and take the specific characters out. These are characters from The Handmaid's Tale. And I could really plug in characters from any two books or characters from any two texts or any two movies. Most characters have some similarities and some differences. Just like I have some things in common with you, I have other things that make me unique. So that's a generic statement that's not really saying anything. And then also saying that they help us understand an important theme. Well, most texts, most stories have important themes. So what is the actual theme? And how are the similarities and differences shining light on this theme or developing this theme? And what are the similarities and differences? So this thesis statement is way too vague. Now, I would imagine the prompt said something like compare and contrast these two characters and connect your findings to a theme. So I can see how the person might be trying to restate the prompt. But remember, in college level English classes, of course, you want to follow the instructions, but you have to do something with the prompt. You have to go far beyond the prompt and make your own argument. Here's a better one. Although Offred's mother and Aunt Lydia are on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, both characters see Offred's generation of women as a transitional one. Atwood suggests that extremism on the right is more dangerous than extremism on the left, but by drawing attention to their similarities, including their inability to see Offred as a complex person rather than a symbol, Atwood suggests that fanaticism of any kind can be dangerous. So not a perfect thesis statement. It could be cleaned up and made a little bit more concise, but I do like how this thesis statement is much more specific than the original thesis statement, right? It tells me what their similarities and differences are, and it also tells me what this theme is, and it also tells me how the similarities and differences help me to see the theme in a new way, right? Help teach the reader something new about fanaticism of some kind. So I hope these tips help. Remember, writing a thesis is a process. You should go through drafts and drafts of your thesis statement, always tinkering with your thesis statement and going back and making sure that your essay is proving your thesis and nothing but your thesis. If you find that writing a thesis is a struggle, that's actually a good sign, and that makes me happy.